Hello, thank you for tuning in and coming to the launch of Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History. We're just going to wait for a minute or two to get everybody settled in and ready to go. But thank you very much for joining us. We're very excited about this. So we're going to start the conversation in about 1 minute, and then we will get rolling. We have a lot of excitement and attention and interest in today's book, and deservedly so. And we are just waiting for everybody to come in and get logged in. Yeah, and it looks like a lot of you are now logging in. So thank you again for tuning in and joining us for today's event. We are very excited about it, and it will start in about 45 seconds or so. We're just giving people a little bit of room to log on. It is lunchtime after all, and everybody has to get their sandwich and get settled in their cup of tea. And we will be going in about under a minute now. So this is the first of what I'm sure will be many conversations about this book, Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History. And this one is almost hot to the touch. So hello, my name is Chris Reed. I am the publicist at University of Toronto Press. And on behalf of the whole team here, I would like to welcome you to the first of many conversations about this book, Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History. It is a collection that has been edited by Michelle Johnson and Funke Aladajibi. And before we get rolling, I just would like to acknowledge that the land on which UTP operates has been for thousands of years the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still the unceded home to many Indigenous peoples from all across Turtle Island. And we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. And we are also very grateful to host a collection of a number of people, I should say, who contributed to today's volume, and they will be in conversation with the editors. Before I bring them on, I just wanted to let everybody know that should you order your copy of this book from the UTP website, there is a coupon code that will give you 25% off the list price, and it expires on April 30th. And that code is Unsettling 25. So Unsettling with a capital U 25. So that please use that to get yourself a 25% discount. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the two editors who have made this incredible project happen. The first is Michelle Johnson, who is a professor in the Department of History at York University. And the second is Funke Aladajibi, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. And so at this point, I am now going to step off the virtual stage and hand it over to Michelle and Funke. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And welcome to everyone who's joined us for today. I'd just like to start off by creating some context for today's discussion. Unsettling the Great White North, this volume has grown out of a desire to offer an intervention into the continual construction of Canada as a geographically and demographically white space, a space which confirms and theorizes, this book confirms and theorizes Blacknesses within this country's historical narratives. By centering persons of African descent within the chronicles of Canada's past, the volume engages with and interrupts the myth of benign whiteness that has been deeply implanted into the country's imaginary. Through its focus on the individual and shared experiences of Black people in Canada, this collection interrogates the well-worn accounts of peaceful Euro settlement and state creation in exceptional circumstances of racial and cultural tolerance, equity, liberalism, and multiculturalism within what many Canadians believe to be the Great White North. Pristine, unspoiled by the violence of conquest and structural oppression. The contributors to this volume argue that Black communities in Canada, similar to other unacknowledged, vilified, and marginalized racialized communities, by their very being, by their presence, which has been framed by anti-Black racism, hostility, prejudice, and discrimination. These communities have been involved in the project of unsettling that self-image of pristine and innocent white, Great White North. The conversation today continues that work, and we welcome our panelists. And I hand it over to Funke to welcome our panelists.
So I have the distinctive pleasure of introducing our wonderful panelists today. The first of which is Claudine Bonner, who is a scholar of African diaspora history and education and is a member of the sociology department and women's and gender studies program at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. Her research is grounded in history and is broadly applied in analyses of race, gender, and education and identity in contemporary Canada. Her scholarship bridges the gap between studies of the Black Canadian experience and the broader African diaspora. Claudine Bonner's current research explores early 20th century Caribbean migration to Eastern Canada and Pan-Africanist connections between these communities. Our second panelist, Amoba Gooding, is an associate professor of Pan-African studies at Kent State University. Her ongoing research includes the study of African Canadian organizing, leadership, and community building. She is the editor of Constructing Black Canada, Becoming Canadian, a special edition of the Southern Journal of Canadian Studies. Her publications can also be found in African Canadian Leadership, Perspectives on Continuity, Transition and Transformation, Stenstilo, Moving Forward in Indigenous Higher Education, the Journal of Black Canadian Studies, as well as the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and Wagaru, the Journal of Transnational Women's and Gender Studies. Daniel McNeil is a professor and Queen's National Scholar Chair in Black Studies at Queen's University. His teaching and scholarship brings together history, diaspora studies, cultural studies, and cognate fields of inquiry to explore the complexities of global Black communities in the 20th and 21st centuries. He is the author of Sex and Race in the Black Atlantic and is the co-editor of Migration and Stereotypes in Performance and Culture. Thinking While Black, his book about political aspirations and the cultural achievements of soul rebels, Black Atlantic intellectuals, and plenary humanists over the past 50 years will be published this year. And finally, Barrington Walker is an Associate Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and professor in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University. He is the author and editor of several books, including Race on Trial, Black Defendants in Ontario Criminal Courts, 1858 to 1958. He is also currently working on a forthcoming book, which we look forward to reading. So with that being said, I would like to kick off our discussion today by asking our opening question to panel speakers. And I guess we will start with you, Claudine. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your chapter in Unsettling the Great White North and how it relates to your research interests.
Okay, thank you, Funke. Before I even do that, I think I'd like to say thank you to both you and Michelle for even inviting me to be a part of the panel. And congratulations on this wonderful achievement. I am absolutely thrilled to have been part of the project. So my chapter, it's titled, or the preliminary portion of my title comes from this notion of how people of African descent were seen and going to be greeted by this place called Canada. It's titled Likely to Become a Public Charge. And it speaks to a period, well, my chapter speaks to the period 1900 to 1930. And it comes out of this time when, starting in the late 1800s, men from across the globe started flocking to Nova Scotia to work in coal mining. And at the close of the century, they came for steelmaking, specifically to Sydney, Nova Scotia. And in both cases, this included men from the Caribbean. The response to the arrival of these men from the Caribbean at the ports was concern and, in some cases, panic. So for the chapter that I contributed to the collection, I revisit some of the documentary evidence from the Canadian Immigration Branch, and I look at how the province of Nova Scotia played a prominent role in maintaining a practice of gatekeeping based on what was really an arbitrary racial hierarchy that essentially said that Blacks were not welcome in Canada. So essentially, in response to the arrival of Caribbean migrants, the ports of Nova Scotia were kept on alert for about 2 decades while the staff worked to justify the barring of access to Canada. The chapter is an exploration of a period when authorities were preoccupied with cultivating citizens. And as part of their preoccupation with cultivating what they considered the right kind of Canadians, they were equally concerned with ridding Canada of those that they considered unfit and undesirable, people who didn't necessarily meet the physical, the moral, and the mental requirements of citizenship. So with that, the chapter also looks a little bit at ways that Caribbean immigrants found to circumvent this process of exclusion. And the look at immigration is part of my broader exploration of the formation of the Caribbean community of Whitney Pier in Cape Breton. And for those who don't know, Whitney Pier is essentially a community that housed the workers in the Dominion Iron and Steel Company in Sydney, and where generations of African Nova Scotians would work until it closed in the 1960s. So the work that this chapter does is it looks at a big part of this story. And it fits really well into my general interest in African diaspora migration in the Americas, and specifically in terms of situating Atlantic Canada within the geographies of the African diaspora. So thanks, that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And I think in some ways it really does connect to parts of Amoba's chapter as well. So Amoba, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your chapter and of course how it relates to your research interests.
Thank you. I second what Claudine said. Congratulations and thank you for inviting me to this panel, but also to the project. As a faculty and now administrator working from the US, this excites me for so many reasons. My work is, I'm coming to realize over time, is deeply personal. So although this narrative is not in my chapter, my parents migrated when I was a child, and a woman by the name of Eula Campbell came knocking on my parents' door to gather all of the Black and brown children in the apartment, but also white children. And she formed an informal organization where every Saturday we walked down to York Memo. We lived on Keele Street, and we celebrated Africa, the Caribbean, but also global Blackness in a way that I was not getting in the schools. And she did this in an informal way. We had showcases for our family. She was a student at the University of Toronto at the time. And so the work that I do was really because she became my role model in a lot of ways. She, in private conversations with her then fiance, talked about Canadian media and the atrocities that was happening to First Nations and Black folks. And she really encouraged us to stay away from media and really wanted us to cleave to cultural centers and community organizations as a way to uplift ourselves. So in a lot of ways, this is about, uncovering, exploring, and really centering the African Canadian experience in Canada while pushing back against these atrocities of Canada as innocent in its, how it's implicated in its violence against First Nations and Black folk. And what I try to do is really think about the kind of the new political and cultural temporalities that Black folks, as they're moving throughout the Canadian nation, actually pry open this notion of Blackness, that there's multiple ways of being Black, and in a lot of ways pushing for new formations in terms of community organizations, some that are advocating for change, but some that are really centering helping. They're coming from the service positions and kind of a social work, social service perspective. And so the work that I do is really about thinking about how Black Canadians have used informal and formal organization to really center hope. But also, I'm thinking of Ronaldo Walcott's new book on the land, long emancipation, right? This path towards freedom, and organizing is really around freedom.
Thank you so much for that. And in a lot of ways, I think Daniel's chapter also troubles these concepts of citizenship and nationhood in really interesting ways that kind of bring all of these conversations together. So Daniel, please tell us a little bit about your chapter and how it, of course, intersects with some of your research interests.
Sure. Thanks, Funke. Thanks, Michelle. My chapter is called Wrestling with Multicultural Snake Oil, a newcomer's introduction to Canada. It responds to your really kind and generous invitation to contribute to the book. It engages with my lived experiences as a migrant who worked through a variety of documents that pontificated about Canadian customs and beliefs, you know, the Newcomer's Guide to Canada, etc., when I was applying to become a permanent resident. And I think it's wrestling with my interests in pushing what can seem rather narrow, rather professional, rather routine discussions about Blackness within Canada, about multiculturalism within Canada, about equity, diversity, and inclusion within Canadian institutions into livelier and more radical directions. Put slightly differently, I'm grateful for the invitation to contribute to the book. What was it, maybe 5, 6 years ago? Long time ago, because it not only allowed me to think about how it related to my existing research or my research at that time, but it opened up a range of interdisciplinary conversations and possibilities. So I'm really grateful for that, and thank you for that. It's prompted me to think more deeply about lived convivial multicultures on the buses, on public transportation in Toronto and in Ottawa. It prompted me to delve into archives across Canada about departments and initiatives on anti-racism, Canadian heritage, human rights, immigration, multiculturalism, the status of women, etc. It was also a fantastic opportunity to engage more deeply with cultural theorists such as Paul Gilroy and Black Atlantic intellectuals who invite us to consider official and corporate forms of multiculturalism as ideas, as mythologies, as government strategies, as media discourses, and yes, as, to paraphrase Gilroy, snake oil. I'll maybe put some images in the chat if we have a chance as well that can help us to think through this. But in other words, I've been interested in how we can connect the rather unconvincing top-down depictions of happy, smiling, multicultural subjects used to project Canada as a tolerant nation of immigrants, to anti-racist and decolonial critiques of multiculturalism policies and the programs funded through it, particularly how they can be understood as mechanisms to veil the violence of settler colonialism and perpetuate the politics of recognition. I've wanted to think with and through public and private statements of politicians, activists, civil liberties campaigners, and to try and address the kinds of state documents that talk about racism in Canada, maybe as a problem, but they tend to frame racism not, and I quote, as a very serious problem. And again, I'm thankful for how it's invited interdisciplinary conversations with Canadian Journal of Communication, Caribbean Philosophical Association, invitations to contribute to research handbooks about multiculturalism, as well as conversations with NGOs, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and perhaps most stimulating for me, working with students to co-create websites, social media pages, to imagine what it might mean, what it might look like to bring multicultural realities into focus, and imagine an immigrant guide to Canada that rejects the oversimplifications of top-down approaches, the idea that migrants and ethnic groups always have to be grateful for this horrible gift of multiculturalism and perform gratitude in the hopes of receiving recognition, and to work and to think through how we can cultivate spaces for critical reflection and collaborative action about the ways scholars, creatives, and activists have always already adapted, promoted, and contested official and corporate forms of multiculturalism. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. And in a lot of ways, these ideas around cultural theory and the way that Blackness is taken up within this discourse of multiculturalism really also helps us to think through the interdisciplinary nature of the contributions in the volume, and the way in which Barrington Walker's chapter also complicates the potential of history and the discipline of history and what it can do and its absences. And so I was wondering if, Barrington, you can speak a little bit about your chapter in the volume and, of course, how it intersects and connects to your own research interests.
Thank you, Funke, for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. And I've listened to the other panelists with great interest and admiration as this conversation has unfolded. Thank you very much as well to Michelle for doing this work, to both of you doing this work, and for creating this space for others to speak. So my contribution to the collection is titled Critical Histories of Blackness in Canada. And it really is a broad and meditative paper that sought to tackle a number of questions pertaining to the writing of critical histories of Blackness in Canada that build upon the important tradition of storytelling that's such a key part of some earlier historiographies. The chapter is divided into three parts. Part one of my chapter sketches some major historiographical approaches that have characterized African or Black Canadian history. Part two turns to questions of theory and method, and many of those questions of theory and method have been explored, or inspired rather, like others on this panel, by the work of critical theorists and Black Atlantic theorists. And part three examines the histories of Black people and the racial state. And the racial state is sort of important to the way that I think about the histories of African descended people in Canada, by taking up three case studies of in the 19th century that feature questions of race, citizenship, and coloniality. So in terms of its relationship to my research interests, I think my research interests have been reflected in the major sections of the paper. I think over the course of my career, particularly sections 2 and 3, I've sought to do theoretically engaged work on the experiences of Black people, again, vis-a-vis the racial state, and for me, primarily through the lens of legal history, legal institutions, legal processes, and legally enabled forms of resistance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Barrington. Like the excellent scholars that they are, our panelists have managed to synthesize some of our questions and to answer in this first round some of the questions that we had for them. So I'm going to launch the second question, which might be based on our time, our second and final round, giving you an opportunity to reflect on where the field is going. So given the recent and increasing interest in Black Canadian history, Black Canadian studies, where do you see this field going? And this time I'm going to start with Amoba and then go round ending the other way. So please tell us, where do you think this field is going? Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I didn't answer the second part of your question. So my chapter is on establishing communities, and I'll in kind of situating my own research interests, which is really about community organizing, collective action that pushes back against atrocities, and how Black Canadians come together to do that. So my work does two things. One, I want to honor that it is around pushing back about taking up anti-Black racism, but in essence, it's also about this idea of centering hope and care and creating the spaces away from the white gaze. And I really think this is where the field is going. I'm thinking after the death, for example, of George Floyd, and of course, Regis Korskinski Paquette, right? So there is a lot of discourse now about healing and self-care. And I think part of this African diaspora notion is about, one, pushing back, right, against inequities, anti-Black racism, but also really centering how we are going to take care of ourselves mentally, physically, economically, emotionally. So I do see a lot of promise in the field for that. I also think within the larger African diaspora, there's such a great space for Canada. I think the global Black world has a lot to learn from the Canadian experience in terms of how we have icons that exist in these other spaces, how we think of transnationality, and we're connected to it in kind of a global diasporic ways, kind of a sensibility, if you will. So I do think that in terms of the field in Canada and the field globally, that it's kind of expanding the notion of Blackness and then really picking up this idea of collective action, but also self-care.
Thank you so much for that. This is absolutely the case. So many times we hear the critique that so much of Black scholarship focuses on the pain, not so much on the joy. And we're seeing this shift beginning in Black Canadian studies as well. Thank you so much for that. Daniel, what do you think? Where is this field going?
Okay, thanks. I see in the chat, Catherine McKittrick has welcomed us and celebrated us as well. So one way at which I'd answer that question is to think about the incredible faculty such as Catherine, the incredible students and staff at Queen's that I'm working with to think through historically informed and forward-looking approaches to Black studies, what it means to think through political, intellectual, artistic and activist work of global Black communities, what it means to think through interdisciplinary studies of liberation and decolonial praxis. In our new minor in Black Studies, it's always thinking through multi-scalar approaches to Black life and livingness. What does it mean to engage with complexity and contestation? Yes, within Canada, but also to invite conversation about translocal connections as well as transnational, right? So I think there's a tendency to talk about African Americans in conversation with Ghanaians, in conversation with Black British studies, Black Canadian studies. We're always inspired by the stimulating work of scholars such as Catherine and Richard Eiton, is to think through translocal connections too. What does it mean to place Marseille and Charleston and Liverpool in conversation, as well as to think about the type of tyranny of methodological nationalism that often confines and defines some of these conversations. So some of the things that I do see the field moving in directions where we can think through what it means to bring scholars and creatives and activists in conversation with each other, what it means to think about working together within and also outside of conventional politics to change things, what it means to approach these questions with humility, not in terms of I'm an expert, listen to me, but bearing in mind C.L.R. James's reminder that ordinary people do not need an academic elite to tell them what to do or how to think. So one of the things that clearly Black Canadian studies can think through is intellectual work within and beyond academia, and not so much domesticating or simplifying the kind of moral and political intelligence of Black communities for easy digestion and consumption, but thinking about how it always unsettles, troubles, disrupts. Some of the calls for accessibility, some of the calls for sharp and snappy things to say on Twitter, some of the ways in which people might not want to do the work, but be seen to be doing the work, people who might want to monetize outrage. And so part of what we can think through with Black Studies, I think, is what does it mean to cultivate space for difficult conversations, to confront some of the corporate, academic and political institutions, as well as academic ones, that combine this type of shiny corporate multicultural sheen, the type of entrepreneurial fantasy, managerial technique, identity politics, market-driven policies, mystique of meritocracy with the allure of technocratic expertise. So it's always, I think you're right, Michelle, to think about how we address resilience and creative artistry, how we think about politically infused acts of pleasure, but also how these are always in conversation, in dialogue, in relation to the structuring capacities of the institutions in which we live and work.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I mean, one of the things that marks Black Canadian studies, Black Canadian history, is the acknowledgement that boundaries were ways of keeping out, keeping in, deciding who was in, who was out. And the scholarship seems to be shattering those boundaries, to be saying, no, these don't make sense for Black people, and certainly not Black people within the current geopolitical space called Canada. Thank you so much. And let me move now to Claudine. Claudine, from your perspective, where do you think the field is going?
Thank you. I've been listening to everyone, and I'm thinking about when, places like Huron University first launched their Black History program, and when other places started, academic programming around Black history, Black studies, Black Canadian history, Black Canadian studies. And for me, I'm thinking less in terms of the rich intellectual tradition that we're entering into, and how we're kind of building on and continuing these conversations. And I'm in the space of being cautiously optimistic about the possibilities and asking the question, where are we positioned within the neoliberal university? What does the future of the disciplines look like as we have these conversations? Trying to, as I look at my colleagues across the country trying to create these programs, and perhaps on the East Coast we're a little further behind than in some spaces, but watching the establishment of the programs and seeing the process of defining and highlighting the distinctiveness of the research material in Black studies, trying to answer questions like what methods come out of this distinctiveness that aren't or can't be replicated, or maybe we should say better contained by traditional disciplines. And so for me, the immediate future of the disciplines is more about a process of defining a Black Canadian history or studies as distinctive fields. Because while there are many of us for whom these definitions are clear and longstanding, as I think you said in your question, Michelle, for many, they're about recency. And so I think if we have distinctiveness in terms of the kinds of materials, the combinations of expressive life and different methodological approaches, then, there can't be question as to whether or not we're a discipline. And in some places, this program creation is happening without a real understanding of the rich intellectual tradition that already exists. When we think about the intersections of the Black Atlantic and the local and the regional cultures. So in terms of where I see things going, as with anything else, I imagine there'll be lots of growing pains. I think there's still some degree of precarity in the sorts of research and the teaching that we do. Inside the academy, I listened to Danielle speak just now, and inside the academy with all the rhetoric of multi and interdisciplinary work, I think it can still be viewed with some degree of suspicion. Not I think, it can and is viewed with some degree of suspicion. But with all that said, I still can't help but be excited and hopeful when I see, younger scholars doing the work and taking up the space. So for me, the future is exciting and it's hopeful. We're making something that's entirely our own and connecting to this broader tradition, looking at transborder, translocal, transnational connections and understanding where Canada fits within the broader Atlantic world. And so I think the growing pains are just part of that process.
Thanks so much, Claudine. In the last 2 years, many of us have stood back with amazement, watched with, well, a combination of consternation and hope, because in the wake of George Floyd's death and murder, and in the wake of the global uprising, many of our institutions suddenly woke up out of a slumber of many, 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 many decades and generations to realize that for all of the rhetoric, there had been little done. And we watch and we are cautious because we know that these institutional maneuverings are not to be taken entirely at face value. So I share your excitement as I watch these positions opening up across the Canadian institutions, and I share some of your caution as well, as I hear in the background of your statement, Claudine, that the scholarship needs not just to be welcomed in positions, but actually given space to occupy its place in the academy, in the community, in the larger society. Thanks for that. And Barrington, over to you. Where do you think the scholarship is going?
I mean, I think I would agree, Michelle, with much of what some of the previous speakers have said on the second question. I think the field is becoming unmoored. I'm thinking particularly of Black Canadian history, but to some extent, its intersection with Black Canadian studies. I think it's becoming unmoored from some of its liberal foundations. I think the liberal foundations that were evident in early bodies of work. What I think of as kind of the nation building, Underground Railroad through civil rights, multicultural framework, right? So the We Built Canada Too kind of orientation of Black Canadian history and to an extent Black Canadian studies. I think it's clear from looking at the contributors to the collection and some of the comments that some of the other panelists have made that a more critical, perhaps radical school of thought seems to be emergent in Black Canadian studies and Black Canadian history, and it borrows from critical and analytical and methodological perspectives from an interdisciplinary body of work. It also seems to me that it decenters the nation state in ways that previous bodies of work perhaps have not done. And it also puts the question of Black liberation and Black freedom at the very center of the questions that it asks in the modes of inquiry, and links these questions around Black liberation and Black freedom to post-colonial struggles globally, and ideas around post-colonial struggle and liberation elsewhere and in Canada. And lastly, I think in the midst of all this, there's been a very decided return to the histories of slavery in Canada. And there's a number of young scholars that have returned to this question, and this slavery is getting, I think, renewed and well-deserved attention. And then from this, I think, also quite a bit of focus on the links between slavery's afterlife, and contemporary unfreedoms in Canada.
Thank you so much, Barrington. And conscious of the time, we have about 20 minutes left. I'd like us to turn to the questions that have been placed in the chat by our persons who are attending today's event. I'll start with the first one, and then Funke can follow up with the one for Amoba after this one. So there's one for Daniel that I'll read out, and then one for Amoba, which Funke can read out. So it says, question for Daniel. Daniel, get ready. Can you elaborate more on the re-envisioned immigration guide you mentioned? Are you developing a new guide? Could that guide replace or substitute for the existing one? Can you tell us more about the contents and how they might differ from the existing guide? And if you are not developing a new guide, Daniel, maybe the first part of the question, what would a re-envisioned immigration guide look like?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the question. So it's a launching point into a set of questions, right? So it is a way for us to talk back to the one I cite in the chapter is a newcomer's introduction to Canada, which claims to tell recent arrivals in Canada what they should do to become respectable Canadians. I'll just quote a couple of the comments from it, but the edition published by the Ministry of Public Works in 1997, it proclaims that there is this set of Canadian norms in which Canadian men, quote, may formally embrace old friends and family, but almost never kiss other men in public. It claims that passionate kissing or touching are considered impolite and offensive in public. And so what I was interested in thinking through is how these types of heteronormative declarations, rather cartoonish, kind of Ontario-based or Anglo-Canadian perspectives were placed in counterpoint with demands that recent arrivals in Canada demonstrate or perform public displays of deference when interacting with Canadian police officers. And so it has a section on acceptance, tolerance, and respect, where it says some people may tell you that there is no racism in Canada. Others may say that racism is a very serious problem. The truth lies somewhere in between. The majority of Canadians are, quote, fair-minded. And so I just wanted to open up space for students, for others, to shift the question. So rather than saying, what do recent arrivals need to do to comport themselves as respectable Canadians? How can we acknowledge the moral and political intelligence of recent arrivals that helps us to think differently about what the lived realities, the lived multicultures in Canada look like and feel like? And so it's not so much, here's a guide, here's what you need to do, but more, how can we set up podcasts? How can we set up using mechanisms through dance, through digital media to rethink the kind of unconvincing top-down narratives and give more space to diverse and the knowledges of communities.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. And so continuing on with some of the questions that we have in the chat, this question is directed to Amoba. Has the Canadian state fostered or instigated, because of its outrages, Black migrant community building in certain ways? And have other ways been ignored? If you've, so basically they're asking the question around whether or not the Canadian state has fostered or has instigated in some way some of these community building projects, and in what other ways have they ignored some of these community building initiatives?
Certainly the Canadian nation as kind of part of this larger colonial architecture and the way in which anti-Blackness is embedded in the practice of Canada. We see that community organizing is pushing back against racism, pushing back against this afterlife of slavery. Certainly we can say the Canadian nation then, pushed Black organizing in a particular way. But I'm very careful to disempower Black folk in that way, that the only reason they act was because of anti-Black racism. What I'm thinking of is a larger project in which, when we think of Black Canadianness, really thinking of a path towards freedom, that there was a desire, right, for pleasure. There's a desire for spontaneity. There's a desire for even movement that is not about always responding to the Canadian nation. So I would say yes and. Right? So yes, there was a response to colonialism, capitalism, but also there's embedded in Blackness and Black desire, this idea of desire for freedom, for hope, that pushes one to organize and to care for the community in which they're centered in.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm going to jump and then come back down to a question about critical race theory. So this one I'll launch at Barrington, because why not Barrington? Get ready. So critical race theory is under threat. In the United States, there's all this discussion, and as we know, that so-called border just below us here is a fictive border. So do you think that the attitudes, and I'm just paraphrasing a little bit, just building on the question a bit, do you think that the attitudes that are fueling the resistance to critical race theory might be present here, and that we might, in the Canadian institutions, also come across this resistance to this so-called threat?
Ooh, that is a tough question, but a great question. I've been thinking a lot about, and I've talked about this in some other talks I've given during Black History Month, probably like others on this call, about kind of the newly emergent right-wing populism that North America seems to be in the grips of. I see part of this as being manifested in some of those conversations about critical race theory in the United States, and various jurisdictions moving to render critical race theory problematic, if not illegal. So, I mean, I think the short question to whether this could happen here, and I think that it's yes, right? I think we're experiencing many of the same forces of populism, a lot of the same anxieties about critical race theory that exist in the United States also exist here. And I think it's something that we have to be vigilant as educators about pushing back on some of these misapprehensions about what critical race theory is, what it purports to do, because there's to my mind an astonishing degree of ignorance that is prevalent in some of the discourse about a critical race theory, just a fundamental misunderstanding about what it is. So, I do believe that universities have a role to play. I believe that folks in universities also have a responsibility to make sure that we keep universities a space where we can have meaningful generative inquiries about this, and really push back against this kind of discourse that now is positing that anything that has any sort of critical reference to the embedded histories of slavery and colonization in North American context is somehow is somehow unpatriotic or verboten, or it's really quite disturbing. And one of the pleasures in the graduate seminar that I'm teaching this year has been to bring the critical race scholarship that exists in Canada to my students, and it's been an eye-opener for them as we've progressed in that conversation. So yes, I believe it. I believe it can happen here. I believe it is happening here in very quiet ways, and I think we need to push back against it, because it really is quite terrifying.
Thanks for that, Barrington. Funke, maybe you can ask Claudine, the last question in the Q&A so far?
Sure, absolutely. So this message will direct over to Claudine, and then hopefully if we have more time, we'll go back, but it looks like we might not. So this is a question interested in the histories of slavery in New France and British North America. And it's asking whether or not you might be able to comment on the longstanding legacies of slavery in Canada in terms of land ownership, employment patterns, wealth accumulation, and or persistent racism. And I think that's very specific to some of the communities that you're talking about at Whitney Pier and external to that. So I'll leave it for you.
Well, where to begin? This is not a small question. And let's see, I'm actually going to bring the question up, so I'm speaking to it. I think this is an excellent question because it's something that oftentimes when one speaks to slavery and the residues of enslavement in Canada, there's a lot of resistance and pushback from people saying, you know, the usual, that's such a long time ago, you know, is it relevant today? Can we even see any of, you know, any residual effects in terms of the things that we're talking about? And just the question of generational wealth is something that is a clear result of enslavement in, as you said, the communities I talk about, the areas I do research in. If you think about the ways that people of African descent in what we now call Canada, when people were given access to being able to purchase land, when people were, you know, who had the ability to own property, who did not? When did that happen? Who was given payouts for at the end of the enslavement period? Like, there's so many things going through my head right now that I'm having trouble like actually articulating this, because first of all, the question is no longer in the question, but so I'm looking for like what are the parts of the question I want to speak to. But the thing that I think we most look at is, for example, when we look at the work of people like Amani Whitfield, who talk about the arrival of the Loyalists in Canada and the re-enslavement of people who arrived to the land in Nova Scotia, what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as free people, who were then re-enslaved and hence had difficulties or were not even given the opportunity to receive land, whilst the Empire Loyalists were receiving land which continues to be passed down through families to today. Farms which existed in parts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the 1700s that have continued to be profitable and very much active today, are the kinds of things that separate Blackness from whiteness in those spaces. So in terms of like the material wealth of those in Canada who benefited from the profits of enslavement, in terms of those who did not, in terms of those who didn't have an opportunity in the same ways, we can see lots of differences between blacks and whites within Canada. And I do apologize. I was really trying to read the question so I, you know, could speak to it properly, but it is no longer there. Could you perhaps repeat it? Or someone else could jump in.
I sent it in your chat for you, but the question is, this person is interested in the histories of slavery in New France and British North America, and is asking if you could comment on the long-term legacies of slavery in Canada in terms of land ownership, employment patterns, wealth accumulation, and of course, persistent racism, which I think you have already addressed.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Claudine. And We're rolling close to time, so I want to pay attention to that. I fear that launching another question might be a challenge. So I just wanted to maybe read the last question, and we'll just let it float if one person wants to respond. I wonder if the panelists might speak to some of the ways that this collection addresses or provides insight, maybe your own work, into the pedagogical possibilities of decolonizing Canadian history in the classroom. And I'll stop. I'll stop there. So the possibility that a collection such as this and your contribution to that collection could help to the decolonization of history in the classroom. Any one of our panelists want to make a quick stab at that? Go ahead, please, Amanda.
So the presence of the collection itself is part of the decolonizing process. I mean, the next part of that for me would be the action of people taking it up and offering it as a text in the classroom or in the spaces that they're teaching. But more importantly, practicing decolonizing, the way in which we teach. Who do we start the story with so that the land acknowledgement statements or even the labor acknowledgement statements are just not symbolic, but they actually mean something in the spaces that we are privileged enough to share knowledge. And I'll stop there in case somebody else wants to say something.
And I also think it's a process of writing in. So it does fill in a lot of the spaces that where Blackness has been invisible or erased. And so providing this text, I think, allows for broader conversations that we haven't been able to have in the ways that the contributors have put them forward before now. I mean, we've been limited in terms of having a collection that actually speaks to or challenges the taken for granted histories of Canada. So I think it's a great opportunity to critically enter into a space and say, this is what is presented as a particular history. This is the counter history. These are the counter narratives that we need to insert into our pedagogical practices.
Thank you, Claudine. And since we are down to maybe our last 3 minutes together, this might be a nice time for us to move to our final section together, and that is last words. Funke?
Absolutely. It's been such an honor and pleasure collaborating with the contributors of this volume. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for taking the time to submit such critical and engaging chapters of your work to this volume. We also wanted to thank the University of Toronto Press for their generous support of this edited collection. And we could not have done this work without the special support of Anna Del Cole, Len Husband, Allison Jacques, Lisa Jemison, Jane Kelly, Stephanie Maza, Chris Reed, and of course, Christine Robinson. The chapters in Unsettling the Great White North ultimately seek to disrupt national narratives that position Canada as a place of racial equality and belonging. These chapters speak to the transformative ways in which persons of African descent have contributed and continue to enrich the land that is now called Canada. But we also position this work as an invitation for continued and expansive conversations among scholars and the general public to interrogate how we understand, how we interpret, and how we feature Black life in Canada. And we recognize that this project of reclaiming and documenting Black Canadian experiences is an unfinished one, and hope that this work contributes to an ever-growing field and discipline seeking to unsettle the Great White North. Off to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Funke. So before I launch into my thanks, I'd just like to tell everybody what an amazing collaborator Funke is. Funke and I, our relationship has moved from one type to another. We won't get into what types. And it's just been a joy, an absolute joy to work with Funke. We would like to use this opportunity to thank our colleagues who joined us today. Thank you once again, Claudine, Amoba, Danielle, Barrington. But if you will indulge me, I want to pause to thank all our colleagues, so please bear with me. Carolyn Smart Frost and Natasha Henry, Adam Aronson and Wendell Adjetti, David Estee, Jenna Bailey, and Sean Mills, Sylvia Hamilton, Deidre McCorkindale, Carl James, Gillian Crease, Anna Ainsworth, Cheryl Thompson and Julie Crooks, Paul Watson, Winfried Simmerling, and Esmeralda Thornhill. Thank you all so much for taking the time. This was a labor of love. It went over many years, many iterations, and we are just so grateful that you stayed with us. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank the Black Canadian artist, scholar Chantal Gibson, whose work from her Redacted Text 2019 installation graces the cover of this work. Her work reminds us that attempts at social and academic erasures from volumes such as these archival documents that she engages with cannot prevent Black resistance, cannot prevent Black resilience, cannot prevent Black life and even Black joy from covering the pages of history. By their careful attention to the lives and experiences of Black people in Canada, all of these contributors have helped to move the dial of the history and historiography of Black Canada. I believe that they would join me in hoping that their work is only part of a larger conversation that Canada needs to have and which is long overdue. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much.
You're on mute, Chris.
There I am. Hello. Thank you very much. Hi. So thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you very much, Funke, for all of your heavy lifting over the many years to make this book happen. And thank you very much to Claudine, Amoba, Daniel, and Barrington for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. It has been absolutely an amazing session and really a great beginning to a conversation that I know will continue, sparked by this book. I did just want to remind people that they can get it at a discount from the University of Toronto website. The discount code, once again, is Unsettling 25, and that is 25% off the list price, and the code expires on April the 30th. So thank you all again for a wonderful first conversation. I look forward to the next one. Okay, take care.